The air in the cathedral is thick with the scent of lilies and old money, but all Saffron Rhodes can smell is the metallic tang of her own fear. Her lace veil feels like a shroud. Behind her back, hidden against the silk of her gown, her thumb hovers over the send button. Come get me. If you still want me. She clicks send. The blue bubble feels like a flare fired into a dark night. Saffron knows the man at the altar is a monster in a designer suit, a pawn in a game her father lost months ago. But Stellan Vane? Stellan is the storm. 3 years ago, he was the one who walked away to protect her from his world. Today, she is inviting the devil to her doorstep. As the organ begins the first heavy notes of the processional, the massive oak doors at the back of the church don't just open, they are thrown wide. The light from the outside world pours in, silhouetting a tall, broad-shouldered figure in a charcoal suit. He doesn't have an invite. He has a Glock, a loosened tie, and eyes that haven't slept since she left him. The congregation gasps, but Saffron only breathes. The storm has arrived. Hello, my beautiful family. Welcome back, and if you're new here, oh, I'm so glad you found us. Come in, make yourself comfortable, you belong here. Before we dive in, I just want to check on you for a second. How are you really doing? Whatever kind of day you've had, whether it was beautiful or whether it broke you a little, I want you to set it down right here, right now. This space is yours. This story is yours. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and drop a hello in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from because I genuinely love knowing. And for my family that keeps coming back, you already know I couldn't do this without you. Alright. Take a breath. Get cozy. Maybe grab something warm to drink. Because today's story? It starts with a text. And it ends with everything. Let's go. Nobody moved. That was the thing about men like Stellan Vane, they didn't walk into rooms, they recalibrated them. The air pressure changed. The temperature dropped. And every person with a functioning survival instinct went very, very still. He stood in the cathedral doorway for exactly 3 seconds, letting the light frame him like something biblical and terrible, and then he walked. Not rushed. Not reckless. Reginald Holt, the man at the altar, her intended, the so-called solution to her family's catastrophic debts, finally broke. He nodded at his security, 2 men near the transept who stepped forward to intercept. They made it approximately 4 steps before one of Stellan's shadows moved, and then they were simply no longer a factor. No shots. No spectacle. Just efficiency. Saffron heard the scuffle the way you hear rain when you're inside, distant, irrelevant. The footsteps stopped behind her. She felt him before she heard him, that specific gravity that had always surrounded him, the way the space near Stellan Vane seemed to contract slightly, like the world leaning in. 3 years. She had spent 3 years pressing that feeling into the back of her memory like a dried flower, something to be preserved and never touched. Saffron. 1 word. Her name in his mouth, low and unhurried, like he was simply confirming what he already knew. She turned. He was closer than she'd calculated, close enough that she had to tip her chin up to meet his eyes, close enough that she could see the faint shadow along his jaw and the thing she'd feared most, he looked exactly the same. Older, perhaps. The lines around his gray eyes had deepened, and there was something carved and permanent in his expression that hadn't been there before. But the eyes themselves, that particular shade of storm cloud silver that had always seen straight through her, those were identical. Unblinking. Fixed entirely on her face as if the chaos around them was simply weather. She had practiced what she would say. She had run through 100 versions in the hour since she'd sent the text, heart hammering in the bridal suite, watching the blue bubble sit there delivered and then, finally, read. She had planned something measured. Something that would make her sound like a woman in control of the situation rather than one who had just detonated her entire life. "You're late," she whispered. something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. Stellan didn't do smiles, not really, not the easy performative kind, but a slight shift at the corner of his mouth that she recognized. Relief, she thought. Or the version of it that a man like him allowed himself. Traffic, he said. He held out his hand. She looked at it. The scar along his knuckle, the one she'd traced with her fingertip the last night they'd had together, 3 years ago, before dawn and decisions had dismantled everything. His hand was steady. It had probably never shaken in his life. Behind her, her father grabbed her arm. Saffron, don't you dare. Don't. Stellan's voice didn't rise. It didn't have to. It landed on her father like a dropped stone, flat and final, and the grip on her arm went slack. She took Stellan's hand. His fingers closed around hers immediately, warm and certain, and for one unraveling moment the cathedral, the guests, the ruined wedding, the man at the altar whose face had gone the color of curdled milk, all of it receded. There was only the pressure of his hand and the wild, terrifying relief flooding her chest. Then he was moving, and she was moving with him, back the way he'd come, past the frozen pews and the craning necks and the scattered flowers that had fallen from her bouquet at some point without her noticing. One of his men fell into step on her left. Another behind them. A perimeter assembled from nothing, smooth and automatic, and Saffron understood in a distant, observational way that she had just been extracted from one world and folded into another. Reginald found his voice somewhere near the altar. You have no idea what you've just done, Vane. You know what this means. You know what they'll. Yes, Stellan said, without looking back. Simple. Almost bored. The oak doors opened ahead of them and the May afternoon poured in, sunlight and wind and the smell of the city, the real world pressing in at the edges of all that Lily-Zan candlewax unreality. Saffron's veil caught the breeze and lifted, and she reached up to pull it from her hair with one hand, the pins scattering behind her on the cathedral steps like tiny silver casualties. At the bottom of the steps, a black car idled at the curb. One of his men opened the door. Stellan stopped. He looked at her, really looked, the way she remembered, a sweep of attention so thorough it felt like being read, and something in his jaw tightened. Are you hurt? No. Are you sure? Stellan. She held his gaze. Drive. The corner of his mouth moved again. He handed her into the car, and then he folded in beside her, and the door closed, and the city swallowed them whole. They didn't speak for 40 minutes. The city peeled away in layers, glass towers giving way to quieter streets giving way to the motorway giving way to a darkness that had nothing to do with the hour. Saffron watched it all through the tinted window with her hands folded in her lap and her wedding bouquet abandoned on the seat between them like a small, white surrender. At some point she had kicked off her heels. At some point his jacket had appeared around her shoulders without discussion, without her noticing the moment it happened, and she hadn't taken it off. Stellan worked. That was the only word for it. His phone was in his hand before they'd cleared the cathedral steps, and for 40 minutes he was a man entirely elsewhere, voice low, instructions precise, conversations that ended as cleanly as they began. She caught fragments. Names she didn't recognize. A location. A timeline. The quiet, methodical dismantling of whatever war Reginald Holt's people were already assembling on the other side of this afternoon. He worked the way he did everything, without visible effort, as though catastrophe were simply another item on a list. She watched him the way you watch a fire. Carefully. From a distance you know is not quite safe enough. The fortress, when it emerged from the tree line, was not what the word suggested. No towers, no iron gates rusted from old wars. It was a stone manor set back from a private road, low-lit and severe, surrounded by the kind of quiet that meant the perimeter was already handled. Men materialized as the car stopped. Doors opened. Saffron stepped out onto gravel and bare feet and felt the cold of it shoot straight up through her, grounding, real, the first fully real sensation since she'd pressed send on a text that had ended her previous life. Inside, the entry hall was warm. Dark wood, high ceilings, the smell of something like cedar and old stone. A woman with a steel-gray bun and an expression that suggested she had seen considerably worse handed Saffron a pair of folded clothes without comment and pointed her toward a doorway. Stellan was already talking to someone else. Already 3 steps ahead, as he had always been. The room she was shown to was spare and clean, and she changed out of her wedding dress with the efficiency of someone defusing something. The gown pooled on the floor and she left it there, a collapsed architecture of silk and obligation, and pulled on the soft dark clothing that had been provided. She sat on the edge of the bed. She breathed. She gave herself exactly 4 minutes. Then she went to find him. He was in a study at the end of the hall, jacket off, sleeves rolled, standing over a desk spread with maps and the kind of paperwork that didn't belong in any legitimate filing system. The lamp threw a narrow gold light across his face. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and something in his posture shifted, not softening exactly, but a reorientation, the way a compass needle swings. "You should sleep," he said. "You should answer a question." A pause. He set down the paper in his hand. "Which one?" She stepped into the room. She had spent 3 years building the architecture of this conversation in her head, the walls and load-bearing columns of it, the precise language she would use if she ever stood in front of him again. Now that she was here, all of it felt overbuilt. So she went straight to the foundation. "Why did you leave?" The silence that followed was the particular kind that meant the answer existed and was being measured for damage. "Saffron. Don't." She kept her voice level. "Don't say my name like it's a full stop. I've waited 3 years for this. I sent a text today that blew up my entire life on the slim possibility that whatever we were was real, so you owe me the actual answer. Not the version you practiced. The true one." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled out the chair behind the desk and sat, forearms on his knees, and for the first time since the cathedral he looked like a man who was tired. "Your brother came to see me," he said. 3 years ago. 2 days before I ended things." She went very still. "Marcus. He told me what my proximity was doing to your family's position. Names on watch lists. Business associations flagged. He had documentation. A muscle worked in his jaw. He told me that if I stayed with you, your father's financial situation would be exposed, not gradually, but catastrophically. That the people watching my operation would use you as leverage within 6 months. That I would get you killed by loving you." The word landed between them like something dropped from a height. Loving. Present continuous tense. She noted it with the part of her brain that was still functioning clearly. "And you believed him." "I verified what I could." "And the parts you couldn't verify?" His eyes met hers. "I decided not to take the risk." "You decided," she repeated slowly. "You decided, alone, without telling me, without letting me have a single word in a conversation about my own life." "Yes." The simplicity of it cracked something open in her chest. Not the leaving, she had almost made a kind of jagged peace with the leaving over 3 years of insomnia and bad decisions. It was the architecture of it. The clean, unilateral way he had picked up her life and rerouted it without consultation, as though she were something to be protected rather than someone to be included. "That," she said quietly, "is exactly the problem. I know. You don't get to love someone and remove them from their own story, Stellan. I know that too." She stared at him. He held it, didn't look away, didn't reach for deflection. There was something almost brutal in his stillness, the way he absorbed her anger without flinching, as though he had decided he would take whatever she needed to give and not call it unfair. "Marcus never told me," she said finally. Her voice had gone quieter. He watched me fall apart for 3 years and never said a word. No. He wouldn't have. Something dark moved across his face. Your brother is very good at managing outcomes. She filed that sentence away. The weight of it, the specific way he'd said managing outcomes, that was a thread, and she would pull it later. Why did you come today? She asked. You could have ignored the text. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, no. I couldn't. She stood in the lamplight of his study in borrowed clothes with no shoes and no plan and the wreckage of a wedding somewhere behind her, and she looked at the man who had broken her heart with both hands and apparently couldn't help himself, and she felt the specific, exhausting, terrifying sensation of a door she had thought sealed opening again at the hinges. I need to sleep, she said. Yes. This conversation isn't finished. I know. She turned toward the door. Behind her, his voice came low and even in the quiet. Saffron. She stopped but didn't turn. I'm glad you sent it. She walked out without answering. But in the hallway, alone, in the dark, she pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes. She was glad too. That was the problem. She learned the shape of his days before she learned anything else. He was up before light. She knew this because the second morning she woke at 5 to the sound of silence, that specific, loaded silence of a house where someone is already awake and working, and followed it down the hall to find him at the desk again, or on the phone again, or standing at the window of the study with a glass of water and an expression she couldn't locate a name for. He didn't acknowledge her those mornings. Not rudely. Simply the way a man acknowledges weather, aware of it, accounting for it, not particularly moved. She started sleeping later just to avoid the performance of being ignored with such precision. The manor had a rhythm that had nothing to do with her. Men came and went through the side entrance at intervals she couldn't predict. Calls happened behind closed doors. Occasionally she would pass through the main hall and find 2 or 3 of his people assembled around a table speaking in the low, clipped shorthand of a language she didn't technically speak but was beginning to understand. Threats assessed, assets moved, variables neutralized. Then Stellan would surface from wherever he'd been, say something brief, and the room would reorganize itself around his decision like iron filings around a magnet. She watched him the way she used to watch him, 3 years ago, with the careful, sideways attention of someone who knows better than to look directly at the thing that holds them. He was different. Or rather, he was more. More of what he had always been at the edges, the control, the containment, the absolute economy of expression. 3 years ago there had been cracks in it. Small ones, barely visible, that she alone had seemed to find. A particular softness when he thought she wasn't watching. The way he laughed at things she said, real laughter, surprised out of him against his apparent will. The habit he had of reaching for her hand in the dark like it was something he needed and hadn't planned. Those cracks appeared to have been filled in. What remained was immaculate and impenetrable, a man so thoroughly composed that sometimes, watching him across a room, she thought of the antiquities she'd studied briefly in university. Roman marble. Imperial busts carved to project permanence. Beautiful in the way that things designed to outlast ordinary human feeling are beautiful, technically, coldly, at a remove. On the 3rd day she said as much. They were in the kitchen, which was the one room in the fortress where the architecture of power seemed to relax slightly. She was drinking coffee she'd made herself because the alternative was asking someone, and she had decided early that she would ask for as little as possible in this house. He had come in for something, found her there, and stayed, leaning against the counter with his own cup, not speaking, but not leaving either, which she was learning to read as the closest thing to company that Stellan Vane currently offered. You remind me of something, she said. He looked at her over the rim of his cup. Waiting. There was a bust in my professor's office. Roman, 2nd century, some emperor or general, I never remember which. Perfect face. Completely illegible. She tilted her head. That's what you look like now. All the time. Something moved behind his eyes. Should I take that as a compliment? It isn't one. He was quiet for a moment. Set his cup down on the counter with the small, deliberate care he applied to everything. People in my position can't afford expression, Saffron. It's information. It tells your enemies where to aim. I'm not your enemy. No. A beat. That's precisely why it's harder. She hadn't expected that. The honesty of it landed somewhere soft and unguarded, and she looked away first, which she resented. Later that afternoon she found the thing she hadn't been meant to find. She hadn't been searching, she wasn't that reckless, not yet, but the study door was open and she was passing and the photograph was simply there on the desk, half beneath a manila folder, visible from the doorway. Small, slightly creased at one corner. She recognized it before she recognized that she recognized it. A restaurant, outside, evening light, herself laughing at something with her head tipped back and her eyes shut. Stellan beside her, not looking at the camera. Looking at her. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. She did not go in. She did not touch it. She walked back to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and turned the image over in her mind the way you turn something fragile, carefully, slowly, alert to the possibility of breakage. He had kept it. 3 years. Through whatever had happened in those 3 years, the wars she didn't know about, the decisions made in rooms she'd never enter, the accumulated toll of a life lived entirely in the architecture of consequence. Through all of that, he had kept a small creased photograph of her laughing at a restaurant and left it on his desk where he could see it while he worked. She didn't know what to do with that information, so she simply held it. That evening he found her in the library, a room she had gravitated toward instinctively, because books were neutral territory and she needed something in this house that didn't feel like a negotiation. She was on the window seat with her knees pulled up and a novel she wasn't reading open in her lap, watching the tree line go dark at the edge of the property. He stopped in the doorway. Looked at her. She looked back. "You're going to tell me something difficult," she said. She didn't know how she knew, only that she did. There was a particular quality to his stillness when he was bracing for a conversation, a just perceptible squaring in his shoulders. "Your family's situation is worse than I initially understood." He came into the room but didn't sit. Standing, she had noticed, was his default, as though remaining on his feet kept him available for whatever came next. "The debt your father owes isn't financial. Or not entirely." She closed the book. "What is it?" "Information." His jaw tightened. He promised them access to vein operations. Names, routes, timelines. The cold that moved through her had nothing to do with the room. "He sold you out. He sold us out. Which means the people who want leverage over me now have a direct line to you." He held her gaze with that gray, unflinching steadiness. "This is more complicated than a rescue, Saffron." "It always was," she said quietly. He looked at her for a long moment, that Roman statue face, immaculate and composed, and she watched the marble do what marble shouldn't, fracture, almost imperceptibly, at the edges. Just for a second. Just long enough for her to see what was underneath it. Then it was gone, and he was already turning, already moving toward the door and whatever came next. But she had seen it. That was enough. For now, that was enough. The call came at 2 in the morning. Saffron heard it the way she'd been hearing everything in this house, through walls, through sleep that was never quite deep enough, through the constant low-frequency awareness of a place where something was always happening just outside her line of sight. She lay in the dark and listened to the silence that followed it, the particular silence of a man receiving information that requires complete stillness to absorb, and she knew before she was fully awake that something had shifted. She found him in the study 40 minutes later. She hadn't planned to, had told herself to stay in her room, to wait, to stop moving toward him every time the house changed temperature. But the light under the door was the kind that meant he hadn't moved, and something in her chest pulled like a compass needle, and she was not, apparently, as disciplined as she intended. He was standing at the window. Not working. Just standing, one hand braced against the frame, looking out at the dark grounds with an expression she could only see in profile, jaw set, something carved and remote in the line of it. A glass of whiskey on the desk behind him, untouched. "What happened?" she asked. He didn't turn. "Go back to bed, Saffron. You're not going to tell me to go back to bed when something that involves my family just. It involves considerably more than your family." He said it quietly, which was worse than if he'd said it sharply. He turned from the window then, and she saw the full geometry of his face, the controlled surface of it, yes, but underneath, something cold and deliberate that she recognized as the look he wore when he was managing fury rather than feeling it. He picked up a folder from the desk and held it out to her. She took it. Opened it. Read. The first page was a transaction record. Numbers and dates that meant little to her until she tracked them to their source, her father's legal firm, a shell company she didn't recognize, a series of transfers spanning 18 months. The second page was a contact log. Names. Meetings. A location she recognized as a restaurant her father frequented, paired with names that meant nothing to her and, she understood instinctively, would mean everything to Stellan. The third page was a list. She read it twice before she fully understood what she was looking at. Routes. Schedules. The names of 3 Vane associates with their operational roles beside them. Supply chain details that would have required access to information her father had no legitimate reason to possess, information that could only have come from someone inside, or from someone who had spent years cultivating a source inside, quietly and patiently and with the specific long-game strategy of a man who had always treated his family as assets to be deployed. She closed the folder. "How long?" she asked. 18 months minimum. Possibly longer. He moved to the desk, not sitting, just repositioning, the restless containment of a man with nowhere to put what he was feeling. The transfers started small. Enough to look like standard consulting arrangements if anyone ran a surface check. By the time they escalated, the relationship was established. Who did he give it to? The Morrow faction. He said the name the way you say the name of a weather event, not with fear, but with the precise gravity it warranted. They'd been trying to find a pressure point in Vane operations for 4 years. Your father handed them a map. She set the folder down on the edge of the desk. Her hands were steady. She noted this with a dim, distant surprise, the way you notice unexpected things in moments of shock, the body continuing its business while the mind recalibrates. He used me, she said. Not a question. Working it out aloud, following the architecture of it to its logical endpoint. The wedding. Marrying me to Holt, that wasn't just about the debt, was it? Stellan's silence was confirmation enough. Holt is connected to the Morrows. He is the Morrows' primary legitimate front on this side of the country. He watched her process this, that gray gaze steady and unhurried. Your father didn't just owe them money. He owed them a consolidation. Marrying you to Holt would have given the Morrow faction a direct social foothold in 3 separate networks your family has maintained for decades. Charitable boards, political relationships, old money connections that don't appear in any document but are worth considerably more than whatever financial debt he'd accumulated. She absorbed this slowly. The cathedral. The lilies. The weight of her father's hand on her arm as he'd walked her toward the aisle with the particular determined pride of a man delivering a package he was relieved to be rid of. She had known it was transactional. She had not known she was the transaction and the currency simultaneously. And now that you've taken me, she said carefully, the Morrows don't just want the information my father promised them. They want leverage. His voice was flat. You are leverage, Saffron. Against me, against your family's networks, against the consolidation they've spent 18 months engineering. Taking you from that church didn't just disrupt a wedding. It dismantled a structure they built specifically around you. She walked to the window he'd abandoned. The grounds were dark and absolutely still, the kind of still that meant it was being watched, every perimeter held by men she'd never seen clearly enough to name. She looked at her own reflection in the glass. A woman in borrowed clothes in a fortress at 2 a.m, held in place by a debt she hadn't incurred for a war she hadn't started. "My father knew," she said. "When I sent the text. When Stellan came." She paused. "He knew what it would trigger and he let it happen. He may have counted on it." She turned. "What does that mean?" Something moved across his face. A reluctance, rare enough on him that it registered. "There is a possibility," he said slowly, "that your father's intention was never for the wedding to be completed. That Holt was always a provocation. That the expected outcome was exactly what occurred, me coming for you, triggering a conflict with the Morrows, and the resulting war drawing attention away from your father's exposure long enough for him to negotiate his own exit from the arrangement." The room was very quiet. "He used you too," she said. "He attempted to." The distinction was precise and deliberate. "I don't tend to remain useful to people who treat me as a variable they can move around a board." She looked at him across the study, the lamp throwing its narrow gold light, the maps and folders spread across the desk between them, the untouched whiskey still sitting where he'd left it. A man at the center of a storm he hadn't chosen and would not step back from. She thought of the photograph on the desk. The crease at its corner. The 18 months of patience her father had weaponized, and the 3 years Stellan had spent in a kind of exile he'd chosen for her sake and that had been engineered by the people closest to her. "What happens now?" she asked. He picked up the whiskey. Drank. Set it down. "Now," he said, "we find out exactly how much they know, and we decide what we're willing to do about it." He looked at her steadily. "Both of us. Together. If that's what you want." It was the first time he had offered her the choice directly. No decisions made in her absence. No clean, unilateral protection. Just the question, held out like a hand in a doorway. She met his eyes. "Tell me everything," she said. The dress was black, which felt appropriate. It had appeared on her bed that afternoon with no accompanying explanation, just the garment bag, a pair of heels in her size, and a small velvet box she hadn't opened yet. She'd held the dress up in the light of the bedroom window and understood immediately that whoever had selected it knew exactly what they were doing. Not showy. Not soft. Something architectural, with a neckline that meant business and a cut that suggested she had arrived at whatever room she was entering entirely on purpose. She put it on. She opened the velvet box. Inside, a single bracelet, white gold, thin as a whisper, with a clasp that didn't look like a clasp until you knew what you were looking at. A transmitter, she realized. Of course it was. She fastened it anyway. Stellan was waiting at the bottom of the stairs in a black suit that had clearly been constructed specifically for his shoulders, because nothing off a rack had any business fitting a man like that. He looked up when she appeared, and the thing that crossed his face lasted less than a second before the marble closed back over it, but she caught it. She was getting faster at catching them, those sub-second fractures in his composure, and she filed this one carefully away. "The bracelet fits," he said. "Beautifully." She kept her voice light. "Very romantic." "Does it record audio or just location?" "Both." He held out his arm. "Shall we?" The gala was 40 minutes outside the city, hosted by a shipping magnate whose legitimate business interests were, Stellan had explained with economical precision, roughly 30% of his actual business interests. The Morrow faction used his events as neutral ground, a place where enemies could occupy the same room under the polite fiction of philanthropy and take each other's measure without the inconvenience of immediate violence. Somewhere in that room tonight was a person who had been feeding information from inside vein operations. Finding that person before they understood they'd been identified was the entire point of the evening. Her role, Stellan had said, was to be exactly what she appeared to be, a woman who had blown up her wedding for a dangerous man and was entirely content with that decision. Nothing sold cover like the truth. The venue was what money looked like when it stopped trying to prove itself: high ceilings, low lighting, the particular hum of a crowd that was accustomed to being the most important people in any given room. They walked in together and the room did what rooms always did around Stellan: it noticed, recalibrated, and rearranged its social geometry to account for him. What was different tonight was that it also noticed her, and the noticing was of a specific, charged variety that told her the cathedral had already become a story, and stories in rooms like this spread at the speed of scandal. "They're looking," she said quietly, smiling at nothing in particular, the way she'd seen women do in rooms like this, the pleasant, unreadable expression of someone at ease with being watched. "Let them." His hand settled at the small of her back. Warm through the fabric. Unhurried, as though it belonged there, as though it had always been there. "See the man in the gray dinner jacket near the east pillar. Don't look directly." She didn't look directly. She laughed softly at something he hadn't said, tilted her head toward him the way a woman tilts toward a man she's been thinking about, and in her peripheral vision located the gray dinner jacket. Older man. Pleasant, forgettable face. The studied casualness of someone performing relaxation. "I see him. Harlan Dees. He's been with my import operation for 11 years. The pattern in the leaked documents suggests someone with access to shipping schedules specifically." His voice was barely above a murmur, intimate sounding to anyone watching, operational in content. "His wife is the one in blue near the bar." "She doesn't know." "How do you know she doesn't know?" "Because she still looks happy." She absorbed that quietly. They moved through the room the way he moved through every room, with purpose that looked like ease, and she matched him, because she had grown up in spaces like this and the performance of belonging was practically a mother tongue. Old money, her mother had always said, doesn't announce itself. It simply occupies. A woman intercepted them near the champagne. Somewhere in her 60s, magnificent, the kind of social predator who operated entirely through warmth. She embraced Stellan with the familiarity of long acquaintance and turned to Saffron with a smile that was also, unmistakably, an assessment. "So this is the woman who sent the Mafia to her own wedding," she said, delighted. "I've been in this world for 40 years and I've never seen anything like it." "It seemed the most efficient solution," Saffron said pleasantly. The woman laughed, real laughter, surprised out of her, and Stellan's hand pressed fractionally at her back. Approval, she interpreted. She took a glass of champagne she wouldn't drink and let the conversation carry them deeper into the room. An hour in, they danced. It wasn't planned, or if it was, he hadn't told her. The orchestra shifted into something slower and he simply turned to her and offered his hand, and she took it because they were being watched by at least 3 people who mattered and because, she admitted to herself with something approaching honesty, she wanted to. He drew her in with the practiced ease of a man who had done this in operational contexts before, one hand at her waist, the right distance, the right posture, everything calibrated. Except his hand at her waist was warm in a way that had nothing to do with calibration. And she could feel his pulse at his wrist where her fingers rested, steadier than hers, always steadier than hers, but present. Real. "Dees made a call," he said quietly, near her ear. 20 minutes ago. Stepped out, came back. Reyes clocked it. Does that confirm it? It confirms he's nervous. He turned them slightly, repositioning her in his eye line. How are you holding up? The question surprised her. The softness of it, tucked inside an operational exchange like something contraband. She looked up at him, close enough now to see the faint line of his jaw, the gray eyes moving between her face and the room with the dual attention she was beginning to understand was simply how he existed in the world. I'm fine, she said. You're better than fine. Something shifted in his expression, subtle and certain. You've been extraordinary tonight. She felt it move through her, the specific warmth of being seen by the one person whose seeing had always mattered most. She looked away before he could see what it did to her face. Don't compliment me during an operation, she said. It's distracting. His hand at her waist tightened once, briefly. Noted. They finished the dance. They separated with the easy, unhurried body language of people entirely comfortable with one another, the physical vocabulary of a relationship, performed so thoroughly it no longer felt entirely like performance. Driving back to the manor, the city lights streaming past, she thought about the line between what was real and what they were pretending. She thought about his hand at her waist and his pulse under her fingers. She thought about the way he'd said extraordinary in the particular quiet voice he used for things he actually meant. She didn't reach a conclusion. She sat in the dark beside him and let the thought stay unresolved, because some questions were safer as questions, and she was not yet ready for the answer. She found out the way she found out most things in this house, by accident, and then all at once. It was Reyes who let it slip, which was almost certainly not an accident on Reyes' part, because Reyes had the particular quality of a man who believed in information reaching the people it concerned and was willing to be indirect about it. He said it in passing, in the kitchen, while she was making her second coffee of the morning and he was moving through on his way to somewhere else, something about the car being arranged for Thursday, the northern route, the safe house in Edinburgh being prepped and ready. He said it the way you say things you want someone to hear while maintaining the plausible architecture of not having told them. She waited until he'd gone. Then she put down her coffee cup with considerable care and went to find Stellan. He was in the study. Of course he was. She was beginning to think the man slept there, upright, in the chair, like a general who had decided rest was a negotiating position he couldn't afford. She closed the door behind her. Edinburgh, she said. He didn't look up immediately. Finished the line he was reading, set the paper down, and looked up, the composed, unhurried attention of a man who had known this conversation was coming and had prepared for it without preparing for it adequately. Reyes, he said. Not a question. When were you going to tell me? When the arrangements were confirmed. He leaned back in the chair, which was the closest he came to a conciliatory posture. The situation has escalated since last night. Dee's confirmed what we suspected, which means the Morrows know we identified their source, which means the timeline has compressed. So you're sending me away. I'm moving you to a more secure location while we manage the operational response. The language was precise and careful and she recognized it for exactly what it was, Stellan Vane constructing a sentence the way he constructed everything, with structural integrity in mind, load-bearing words placed to hold the weight of a decision she hadn't been consulted on. That's a very elegant way to say sending me away. Saffron. No. She stepped further into the room because standing in the doorway felt like a position that could be managed, and she was not interested in being managed. We had an agreement. Together. You said together. For days ago in this room you held out an actual choice and I took it, and apparently that was either a temporary offer or something you've reconsidered now that it's become inconvenient. It's become dangerous. The composure flickered, briefly, a fault line running through the marble. There's a difference. There's a distinction, she said. I'm not sure it's one you get to make for me. He stood then, because she'd noticed that he stood when a conversation required his full height, when he wanted the physical reminder of what he was, what he occupied. It didn't work on her the way it worked on other people. It never had. That had always been, she suspected, part of the problem. The Morrows have confirmed your location, he said. We have a window of roughly 48 hours before that information is actionable. Edinburgh is defensible. This property has been compromised. Then we all go to Edinburgh. The operation needs to be run from here. Then I stay here while you run it. That is not, he stopped. Pressed two fingers briefly to his jaw, the contained frustration gesture she'd catalogued in her second day here. You are not trained for what the next 72 hours may require. You are not equipped, you are not armed, and you are not expendable, which makes you a liability in a scenario where I cannot simultaneously run an operation in. And what? She kept her voice even. Protect me? Is that the end of that sentence? He said nothing. Which was confirmation. Stellan. She moved to the desk, his territory, his ground, the place he stood when he wanted to feel sovereign over a situation, and she put both hands flat on the surface of it and looked at him across the paperwork and the maps and the 3 years of distance that had never fully closed. I understand what you're doing and I understand why you're doing it, and I am telling you, clearly, that it won't work. I will not go to Edinburgh and sit in a room while you fight a war that started with my name on a document. That is not something I'm capable of. What you're capable of isn't the. It is entirely the point. She straightened. I am not a variable you move around a board. You said that. Those were your words about my father, and I am telling you that the same principle applies to you. Something shifted in the room. Not in his expression, that remained controlled, careful, but in the quality of the silence around him. She took a breath and made a decision. She went to the kitchen. He followed, not immediately, but within 30 seconds, which told her the speechlessness was genuine. She opened the refrigerator with the energy of a woman who has chosen her battlefield and found it acceptable, removed the block of cheese and the leftover bread from the shelf, and began making herself toast with the focused, deliberate calm of someone who understood that performing normalcy in the middle of an argument was its own kind of power. What are you doing? He said. It wasn't quite a question. Making breakfast. She found the butter. Would you like some? Saffron. The bread is good. I think it's sourdough. She put 2 slices in the toaster and turned to face him, leaning back against the counter with her arms folded. I'm not going to Edinburgh, Stellan. You can arrange the car, you can prep the safe house, you can brief Reyes on a northern route, and on Thursday morning I will still be here in this kitchen making toast. That's the situation. He stared at her. The marble face, the gray eyes, the absolute stillness of a man confronting something his contingency planning had not accounted for, which was, she was realizing, increasingly her natural habitat. You are the most, he stopped. Yes? He looked at the ceiling briefly. Then back at her. If you stay, he said, you do what I tell you when I tell you. No arguments in the field. No unilateral decisions. If I say get down, you get down. If I say get out, you get out. Define field. Anywhere that isn't this building. Negotiable. It is not negotiable. The toast popped. She turned, buttered it with complete attention, cut it in half with a knife she returned precisely to the block. Then she picked up her plate and looked at him. All right, she said simply. He blinked. She had the impression that capitulation, when it came from her, would always land on him like something he hadn't braced for properly. All right, he repeated. Would you like some toast? He looked at her for a long moment, something almost helpless moving through the gray eyes, something that in another man she might have called exasperated tenderness, and then he pulled out a stool and sat down at the kitchen counter. Yes, he said finally. Fine. She made him toast. He ate it without speaking. Outside the kitchen window, the grounds were still and watched and full of men who worked for him, and inside, for approximately 8 minutes, it was just the two of them and the quiet and the ordinary, small miracle of breakfast. It was the most normal thing that had happened since the cathedral. She thought he felt it too, that brief, suspended sense of a life that might be possible, glimpsed through a very narrow window. Neither of them mentioned it. But neither of them left, either. It didn't come on Thursday. It came on Wednesday night, at 11:43, while the house was doing its version of quiet, which was never truly quiet, never the absence of vigilance, but a lower register of it, the night shift of men who worked in darkness because that was where the work lived. Saffron was awake, which she would later think was either instinct or the accumulated effect of a week spent in a house that never fully exhaled. She was sitting on the window seat in her room with a book she wasn't reading and the lights low, and then there was a sound that was not a sound so much as a disruption, a frequency change in the night, something altered in the pattern of the dark outside. Then the lights went out. Full blackout. Not a fuse, the backup generators didn't kick in, which meant the power had been cut at the source, which meant someone outside knew where the source was, which meant the perimeter had already been breached before the first shot was fired. The first shot came 4 seconds later. She was off the window seat before she decided to move, barefoot on the floorboards, pressing herself flat against the wall beside the door the way she'd seen it done in enough films to understand the geometry of it. Don't stand in the frame, don't be where they expect a person to be. Her heart was enormous in her chest. Her breathing was the only sound she could hear until it wasn't, until the corridor outside filled with movement, controlled and fast, the sound of Stellan's men doing what Stellan's men did, and then a door opened and he was there. He came in low and fast, a torch in one hand, something considerably more serious in the other, and he crossed the room to her in 4 steps and his hand found her arm in the dark with an accuracy that suggested he'd known exactly where she'd be. "Stay behind me," he said. Not loud. Not loud at all. "How many?" "Enough." He was already moving toward the door. "Do not separate from me regardless of what you see or hear. If I go down." "You're not going down." A beat. "If I go down," he said again, firmly, "you go to Reyes. Only Reyes. You understand?" "Yes." The corridor was dark except for the thin beams of torches moving at the far end. His people, she understood, establishing a line. Stellan moved her in front of him, one hand on her shoulder, steering her left along the wall toward the back of the house. She could hear it now, not just the sporadic crack of gunfire from outside but the closer, more intimate sounds of the house being entered. Glass. Wood. The specific percussion of men moving through a building with intent. The kitchen. He brought her to the kitchen, which she understood when she saw Reyes already there, a solid, quiet man who had always looked at her with the particular respect of someone who had been watching longer than she knew. Reyes nodded at Stellan and handed her something without ceremony. A knife. 8 inches, fixed blade, the grip worn smooth from use. She took it. Stellan looked at her holding it and something moved across his face, complicated, rapid, gone. "Do you know how to use that?" "I know which end," she said. "That's a start." He turned to Reyes. "South exit?" "Compromised. They're coming in from the grounds on 3 sides. East corridor is still clean." "How long?" 4 minutes. Maybe 3. Stellan made a decision the way he made all decisions, without visible deliberation, the conclusion already reached before the information had finished arriving. "We go through them," he said simply. What followed was not like anything she had a framework for. She had understood, intellectually, what Stellan was. She had understood the violence of his world the way you understand weather in another country, abstractly, at a remove, as information rather than experience. The gala, the safe house, the men who materialized and dematerialized around him, all of it had been the infrastructure of that world, the bureaucratic surface of it. This was the thing underneath. He moved through the east corridor like something geometric, precise and absolute, and the men with him moved in a formation she felt the logic of without being able to name it. She stayed where he'd put her, behind his right shoulder, close enough that she could feel the shift in his body before each decision, and she moved when he moved and stopped when he stopped and kept the knife in her hand and her breathing controlled because panic was a luxury the next 3 minutes could not afford. They hit resistance at the turn into the east wing. 2 men, neither of whom she recognized, and the corridor was very narrow and very dark and what happened was fast and brutal and nothing like the choreographed violence of film. It was close and loud and graceless, and Stellan took a hit. she saw it, his shoulder, the way he absorbed it and kept moving with the terrifying determination of a man who has decided that stopping is not among the available options. "You're hit," she said. "I'm aware." "Stellan. Keep moving." She kept moving. The east exit opened onto the side garden, cold air and the smell of churned earth, and somewhere beyond the tree line the sound of vehicles, his reinforcements arriving, she understood, the wider machinery of the vein operation responding to a signal she hadn't seen sent. Reyes went first, then her, then Stellan, and they crossed the garden in the particular crouched, rapid movement of people making themselves small against a sky that offered no cover. A figure came from the left. Fast, from behind a hedge, directly at her. She didn't think. Later she would examine this, the absence of the gap between perception and action, the way her body made the decision before her mind had filed the paperwork, but in the moment there was only movement. She turned, she brought up the knife, and she used the grip and the angle and the understanding of which end mattered, and the man went down, and she stepped back, and her hands were shaking, and she kept moving. Stellan had seen it. She knew he'd seen it because he was beside her in 2 steps and his hand was at her back and he said nothing, not a word, but the pressure of his hand said everything, steadying, certain, the physical language of a man recalibrating everything he thought he understood about the woman beside him. They reached the vehicles at the property's north boundary. Reyes got the door. Stellan got her inside. He climbed in after her and someone drove and the manor disappeared behind them in the dark, and she sat with her hands in her lap and the knife still in her grip and tried to locate the edges of herself, where she ended, where the last 20 minutes ended, where the shaking stopped and the solid ground began. Stellan was beside her. His shoulder was bleeding through his jacket in a way that required immediate attention. She turned to him and he turned to her at the same moment, and the expression on his face was not the Roman statue and not the controlled operational mask and not anything she had a category for. It was simply him, unguarded, present, looking at her like she was the only fixed point in a night that had come apart at the seams. "You're all right," he said. Not a question. A declaration. As though saying it made it architecture. "You're not," she said. She reached for his shoulder. He let her. Outside, the dark moved past at speed. Inside, she pressed her hand against his wound to slow the bleeding and he covered her hand with his, and neither of them spoke, because some moments don't require language to be understood completely. They found her father in a hotel in the city. Not through surveillance, not through the network of people Stellan could reach with a phone call at any hour, through Saffron, who had thought about it for 20 minutes in the safe house while a medic worked on Stellan's shoulder and the room smelled of antiseptic and held breath, and then said quietly, almost to herself, "The Meridian. He always uses the Meridian when he doesn't want to be found because he's been using it since 1987 and he thinks loyalty to a habit is the same as invisibility." Reyes had been on the phone before she'd finished the sentence. Stellan had looked at her across the room with that gray, unblinking attention. "How did you know?" "Because I know him," she said. That's the thing about being someone's bargaining chip, you learn how they think. The meeting with the Moro faction's principal had been arranged for the following evening. Not by Stellan, by Saffron's father, frantically, in the hours after the ambush failed, attempting to salvage an arrangement that had come apart in the dark outside a compromised manor house. He didn't know they had him. He didn't know the room at the Meridian had been listening since 2 in the morning. He didn't know that the careful, patient machinery of his long game had been dismantled with the same methodical precision he had always admired in other men and failed to anticipate directed at himself. Saffron had requested to be in the room. Stellan had looked at her shoulder, her jaw, the particular quality of stillness she had developed over the last 8 days, and had said yes. The man they went to meet was named Callum Moro. He was not the figure she had imagined from the name, not large, not theatrical, not the cinematic villain her mind had constructed from fragments of overheard conversation and the cold language of the documents she'd read. He was compact and pale, somewhere in his 50s, with the groomed, pleasant appearance of a man who had long ago understood that the most dangerous thing you can look like is nobody in particular. He had chosen a restaurant for the meeting, neutral ground again, the underworld's persistent preference for fine dining as the backdrop for its worst behavior. He was already seated when they arrived. He saw Stellan first, which was inevitable, and the calculation that crossed his face was rapid and professional, risk assessed, options indexed, expression settled back into something cordial before Saffron had fully cleared the doorway. Then he saw her, and the calculation happened again, faster, and this time something underneath it flickered. Uncertainty. The specific uncertainty of a man whose model of the situation has just been revised without his consent. Good, she thought. Stay uncertain. Stellan sat. She sat beside him, and the geometry of it was deliberate. She had positioned herself slightly forward, visible, present in a way that wasn't decorative. Morrow's eyes moved between them. I wasn't expecting both of you, he said. Smooth. Professionally pleasant. No, Saffron said. You were expecting to speak to Stellan about me, which is a dynamic I've decided to retire. A pause. Morrow's eyes moved to Stellan, who offered nothing, no rescue, no redirect, simply the still, watchful attention of a man who had decided to let something play out. Morrow looked back at her. Miss Rhodes, he said. I understand this situation has been distressing. Mr. Morrow. She folded her hands on the table. Her voice was pleasant, conversational, the register she'd grown up using in rooms like this where the real business happened underneath the surface of every sentence. I want to make sure we understand each other, so I'm going to be very direct. The information my father promised you is worthless. Not because he didn't have it, he did, some of it, but because in the 72 hours since your people came through the east corridor of a property you were told was Stellan's primary base of operations, every route, every schedule, every name in those documents has been changed. You paid 18 months of patience for intelligence that is now decorative. Something moved in Morrow's face. A tightening. Furthermore, she continued, with the easy, unhurried confidence of someone who has done the arithmetic and likes the answer, the man who sold it to you is currently in a room on the 4th floor of the Meridian Hotel having a conversation he doesn't know is being recorded, in which he describes, in considerable detail, the arrangement he made with your organization. That recording exists in 3 locations. One of them is a lawyer's office. Another is a journalist who covers financial crime and has been waiting 18 months for something with this kind of documented specificity. The pleasant expression had vacated Morrow's face entirely. What remained was the thing underneath, cold, precise, recalculating. You've been busy, he said. I've had a week with very little else to do. She tilted her head. Here is what I'm proposing. The debt my father owes your organization, financial and otherwise, is settled. Tonight. In exchange, the recording stays where it is, the journalist writes about something else, and the Rhodes family name stops appearing in any conversation connected to Morrow interests. My father faces his own consequences through his own channels. That's not our negotiation. Ours is simply this, it ends here. Morrow was quiet for a long moment. His eyes moved to Stellan, the appeal of one man who operates in a particular world to another, the implicit suggestion that the woman between them might be navigable if approached correctly. Stellan looked back at him with the absolute, gray-eyed serenity of a man who had nothing to prove and nowhere to be. She speaks for both of us, Stellan said. 4 words, and the weight of the entire Vane Empire behind them, and Morrow understood, as men like him always eventually understood, when a room had closed around him. The silence stretched. A waiter appeared at the periphery, assessed the atmosphere with the professional sensitivity of someone who had worked in establishments like this long enough to recognize a certain kind of table, and retreated silently. The debt is settled, Morrow said finally. Quiet. Precise. The sound of a man making a calculation and finding that every available variable pointed the same direction. Thank you, Saffron said. As though he'd passed the salt. They left before the food arrived. On the pavement outside, the night air was cool and ordinary, traffic, distant music, the city going about its business in complete indifference to what had just happened in a restaurant booth over untouched water glasses. She exhaled slowly. Beside her, Stellan was still, hands in his pockets, looking at the street with the particular quality of a man letting his body catch up to a situation his mind had already processed. "The lawyer's office," he said. "The journalist." "Real," she said. "Both of them. I made the calls yesterday while you were being stitched up." She glanced at him. "I told you I knew which end of the knife mattered." He looked at her then, fully, without the marble, without the operational mask, without the 3 years of carefully maintained distance between who he was and what he allowed himself to want. Just Stellan, looking at Saffron, on a pavement outside a restaurant where a war had just been ended with paperwork and precision and the particular sharp-edged intelligence of a woman who had spent her whole life being underestimated and had finally found a use for it. "Yes," he said quietly. "You do." She felt it again, that narrow window, that glimpsed possible life. Only this time the window was wider. This time it looked less like a glimpse and more like a door. "Take me home," she said. He held out his hand. She took it. Home, it turned out, was not a place she had a current address for. The house she'd grown up in belonged to her father's consequences now, lawyers and creditors and the slow, administrative unraveling of a life built on debt and performance. The flat she'd kept in the city had been let go 18 months ago when her father's situation had begun quietly demanding her financial resources alongside everything else. She had walked into a cathedral 2 weeks ago with nothing behind her but obligation and nothing ahead of her but more of the same, and she had blown it all up with a text message and somehow arrived here, standing in the bedroom of the manor with a bag that contained everything she currently owned, which was modest enough to be either devastating or clarifying depending on how you decided to hold it. She decided to hold it as clarifying. Stellan found her there. He had a habit of finding her, she had noticed this, the way he always knew which room she was in without appearing to have looked, the way the house seemed to route him toward her without discussion. He leaned in the doorway and looked at the bag and then at her face and didn't say anything immediately, which was one of the things she had come to understand about him. He didn't fill silences with noise. He waited until he had something worth putting in them. "You don't have to decide anything tonight," he said. "I know." She sat on the edge of the bed. "I'm not deciding. I'm just locating myself." He came into the room then, which he rarely did. Her room had remained, by unspoken mutual agreement, her territory, the one space in the house that was categorically hers. He crossed to the window and looked out at the grounds, and she looked at his back, the breadth of it, the slight pull of his jacket across the shoulder where the wound was healing, the posture of a man who was also, she realized, locating himself. "I need to tell you something," he said, without turning. "All right. When your brother came to me 3 years ago," he paused. The pause had weight in it. "I didn't just believe him because the evidence was persuasive. I believed him because part of me had been looking for a reason." She was very still. "Not because I wanted to leave." He turned then. "Because I was afraid of what staying looked like. What it would require you to absorb. Nights like last Wednesday. Rooms like the one we sat in last night. The permanent condition of being adjacent to consequence." He held her gaze steadily, the gray eyes clear and undeflected. "I told myself I was protecting you. And I was. But I was also protecting myself from having to watch you decide, with full information, whether I was worth it." The room was quiet. Outside the window, the grounds were silver dark, the tree line holding the edge of the property in its familiar watched stillness. "That," she said carefully, "is the most honest thing you've said to me since the cathedral. I'm aware." "You could have asked me," she said. 3 years ago. You could have given me the full information and asked me to decide." "Yes. I would have stayed." Something crossed his face, not the fracture she'd learned to look for but something deeper, older, the expression of a man absorbing a truth he'd spent 3 years on the other side of. I know that now. She stood up. She crossed to where he was standing by the window and she looked at him at close range. The jaw, the gray eyes, the scar at his knuckle, all of it so familiar it had become a kind of interior geography, the map of a country she'd been exiled from and had spent 3 years pretending she'd stopped missing. She reached up and put her hand against his face, and he went very still in the way he went still when something mattered too much for movement. Ask me now, she said quietly. His hand came up and covered hers against his jaw. Warm, certain, the same grip that had closed around her fingers in a cathedral doorway and hadn't felt wrong for a single second since. Come outside, he said. The balcony was off the study, a narrow stone ledge she hadn't known existed until he opened the door she'd always assumed was a cupboard, and the night came in, cool and wide and smelling of the grounds and somewhere beyond them the distant, indifferent countryside going about its business in the dark. There were no chairs. They stood at the railing, side by side, and the sky above was the particular deep blue of late night tipping toward early morning, stars present but not insisting on themselves. She was in borrowed clothes again. He was in his shirt sleeves, jacket abandoned somewhere in the study, the loosened tie that she had come to understand was the only outward concession he made to the end of a day. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, not the silences of the first days here, loaded and careful and full of things being managed, but something that had been worn smooth by 10 days of proximity and crisis and the specific intimacy of people who had been through something together and come out the other side still standing. No church, he said. No lilies, she agreed. No contract drawn up by someone else's interests. She looked at him. He was looking at the sky, jaw tilted up slightly, and she could see the line of his throat and the steady rise and fall of his breathing and the expression on his face, which was not the Roman statue, not the operational mask, not any of the versions of himself he maintained for the world. It was simply the face of a man who had arrived, finally, at the place he'd been navigating toward for 3 years, and found it still there. He looked at her. I want you here, he said. Not as something I'm protecting. Not as a reason or a consequence or a complication in an operational timeline. The gray eyes were steady and direct and completely unguarded. As a partner. Someone who knows the full information and has made the decision with it. A pause. I'm asking, Saffron. What's your answer? She thought about the cathedral and the lilies and the metallic taste of her own fear. She thought about a blue bubble on a phone screen, a flare fired into a dark night. She thought about 40 minutes of silence in a car, a borrowed jacket, the crease in a photograph. A dance at a gala, a knife in a garden, a hand pressed over a wound in the dark. A recording in a lawyer's office and the particular satisfaction of watching a room close around a man who had underestimated her. She thought about this balcony, this sky, this man in his shirt sleeves asking her, finally, properly, with all the information on the table between them. I've known my answer since I pressed send, she said. Something moved through his face, full and uncontrolled and entirely real, the expression of a man who has let something he thought he'd lost come back, and is not pretending to be unmoved by it. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair from her face with a gentleness that sat oddly and perfectly on hands that had done what his hands had done last Wednesday in a dark corridor, and she thought that was perhaps the most accurate thing about him, the contradiction held without apology, the violence and the tenderness occupying the same space without canceling each other out. He kissed her then. Not urgently, with the unhurried certainty of a man who has decided, who has always decided, and is simply done waiting. She kissed him back the same way, both hands at his jaw, and the night was cool and wide around them and the sky didn't care and the grounds were watched and safe and the world they were standing in was still full of complexity and consequence and the particular permanent condition of a life lived at the edge of things. She knew that. She had the full information. She stayed anyway. Below them, the estate held its quiet watch. Above, the stars did their indifferent, ancient work. And on a narrow stone balcony in the dark, with no witnesses and no ceremony and no document requiring signatures, Two people who had spent 3 years on the wrong side of a decision made a different one, not with vows borrowed from tradition, but with the simplest, most unassailable currency available. They chose each other. Deliberately. With full information. That was enough. That was, it turned out, everything. And just like that, the lilies are gone. The contract is ash. And on a stone balcony in the dark, with no witnesses and no ceremony, two people chose each other with full information. No church could have held what that meant. If this story got into your chest, if you felt every silence, every almost, every moment where they were one decision away from losing each other for good, then you already know what to do. Like this video. It costs you nothing and it tells the world that stories like this deserve to be found. Subscribe to Cupid's Vault Stories. Because Saffron and Stellan are just one room in a very large, very dangerous house, and behind every other door is a story that will ruin your sleep schedule and absolutely worth it. And drop a comment below, because I need to know. Were you holding your breath from the moment she pressed send? Or did Stellan have you the second he walked through those cathedral doors with a Glock and a loosened tie and absolutely zero apologies? Tell me. And tell me if you want a part 2, because something tells me Saffron Rhodes isn't done surprising people just yet. The vault is open. Come back soon.